All right. So what I'm going to show you guys next is a little bonus in this series on how to learn tactics. For those of you who don't know, the previous video in this series was one. This lesson here is totally standalone, but the previous lesson here was tactical elements, which was basically learning how to keep track of all the different things in a chess position that could lead to tactics, such as undefended pieces, pieces that can't move, open lines to a valuable piece like a king or queen, pieces being arranged on the same line or same file or diagonal, hidden attacks, pieces with more than one responsibility, etc., etc. There's a whole bunch of different things which, if you have them, you can put them together to find tactics. And so the previous video, I was explaining what those are, showing some examples of them, and explaining an exercise for creating an alarm system so that you know when there might be tactics. This game I'm going to show you here is kind of like a bonus on the theme of tactical elements, and then after that we'll get back to another video on like a third exercise for improving your tactics. But this game here is really cool because it's a great one for keeping track of the tactical elements and practicing, but it's also a cool video because, a cool game, sorry, hopefully a cool video about a cool game. A cool game because it shows something which most people are not explicitly very aware of in chess. And it has to do with the relationship between tactics and strategy. In general, we think of, most of us, you might be an exception, but most of us think of games as having like a general strategical trajectory or strategical story and layout. And the tactics along the way serve the strategy. Okay? In other words, you build up pressure on an isolated pawn, and then because of that, that pawn becomes pinned to their pieces and you create some kind of a tactical possibility. You use tactics to execute your strategy. And sometimes the defending player has tactical resources to prevent the player with the strategic advantage from converting. But in general, we think of tactics as being the means by which the player with the strategic advantage executes that advantage and turns it into a tangible victory. So that's the usual understanding of the relation between strategy and tactics. And we generally think, tactics are available to the player in the stronger position usually. If you get into a tactical mess, it should come out in favor of the player who has the advantage because they've got these positive strategic factors. This is a typical scenario and therefore an average understanding, but it is not at all guaranteed. You can have a strategic advantage and have more tactical weaknesses than your opponent. And you could have a bad position strategically, but have all your pieces defended for the moment and be sort of compact and tactically somewhat sound. So there are exceptions to that. It's not always the person with the better position strategically who also has the better position tactically. And what I'm going to show today is another complication, which is instead of tactics serving a strategy this game, we're going to have a tactical situation, and what the player has to do is recognize the tactical situation and pick a strategy based on the tactics. In other words, in this game, strategy serves tactics instead of tactics serving strategy. Okay, so with that said, let's kick it off. This is a game from long ago, one of my last junior tournaments, and the only junior tournament where I ever represented the U.S. abroad. I was never the top-rated player in junior categories due to my late start. And here we've got an opening I absolutely love, the Benko, but in this case, I'm the one playing white, and I'm the one who chooses a very crass variation against the Benko, knight c3. This is kind of like a tricky and tactical variation that doesn't have a very solid strategic underpinning, because my basic understanding of how to play, well, first of all, if black takes and if white played knight b5, playing knight c3, knight b5 was not the best way to hold this extra pawn, right? And after bishop a6, knight back to c3, you basically could be just back into normal, into the normal accepted variations of the Benko. But the point of this line is actually to play e4 here. How do I... Seems I can't promote this to be the main line. Okay. Anyway, the point of it is to play e4 quickly. And now if black allows white to play bishop takes b5, then everything white did will make perfect sense. They'll have played e4 very quickly in one move. They'll have got their extra pawn that black was offering, and they'll have developed the bishop on f1 to b5 in one move, which is awkward for black and efficient for white. But of course, what's odd about this whole thing is that in this position, black can play b4. And that's what looks really bad about this variation and why I call it crass. You take on b5, not to hold the extra pawn, but in order to let black play a takes b5 back, so you've traded your c pawn for their a pawn, and let black play b4 kicking your knight in a position where black kind of wins control over e4. And, you know, this opening very much is about the fight over e4 between these two knights. And at a point where e5 is just terrible for white, it seems really bad to allow black to play b4. And so the opening pursues with knight to b5. Now, from this point on, it's already a position that is tactically critical. And one important thing to recognize in controversial situations in chess is when there's the possibility for the players to trade off the controversial tactical elements and settle back into a normal or even position, or when you've kind of committed and don't have a way back into calmer waters. This particular crass variation by white is an example of a commitment. Because what is one of the crucial tactical elements in this position right here? It's the trap knight on b5. This is really like the crux by itself of what sends this opening into a particular style of game. But this knight has actually trapped itself. All these squares are covered by black. So this knight doesn't really have any plausible retreat. So from move 6 or 7, we have a piece that can't move, and a pretty valuable piece at that. So it's difficult for white to extricate this knight, which means white is kind of committed to a pretty aggressive game plan. Now, at the same point, as soon as the knight comes in contact with these two squares, it becomes important to notice a couple bad tactical elements for black. These are tactical elements that you're born with, but which I wouldn't count until some piece comes in contact with them. So one tactical element you're born with is that in the starting position, the king is a trap piece. Just like this knight has become a trap piece, this king is a trap piece. It's a very valuable piece that can't move, and white is actually in contact with, moves that would essentially checkmate or win the game instantly, right? So like if we had a bishop on f4, knight c7 would win a queen. If black's if black's e-pawn were busy in some way, then knight d6 might win the game. And then the other thing is the knight being in contact with c7, which is this knight fork. Again, you're born with your king and rook arranged such that there are knight forks. It only really starts to become a relevant factor to follow once you have a piece actually start to come in contact with the key squares for doing that. So for example, there's a very important tactic in this position. Other tactical element is that this pawn is undefended, right? So there's a very important tactic in this position that you guys should know about, which goes knight takes e4, queen e2, attacking the knight, and starting a hidden attack on the king. So it's only move 8, but the position has just exploded with tactical elements, right? Here, white had an undefended pawn. But as I mentioned in the previous thing, when you take advantage of your opponent's weak tactical elements to win something, that's the moment where you're most exposed. So now black also has an undefended knight, and it's on the same line as this king that can't move. So after queen e2, white's actually winning in this position because the key point is like if a knight retreats, you have this checkmate here. Now suddenly we've got this overworked piece, right? It's blocking the hidden attack of the queen on the king, and it's the only piece stopping knight d6 checkmate on the king that can't move, right? And just a quick variation for those who want thoroughness, you notice that f5 doesn't save black because the knight can also cover f7. So black still is basically faced with losing a piece here after knight e4. Okay, so black can't take on e4. All right, fair enough. Black plays d6 and doesn't take on e4. Black's not in a hurry to cash in on this e-pawn because really what black wants to do is avoid these tactics and then eventually take advantage of this bad tactical element, the trap knight. So black has a lot to look forward to here and can proceed with some caution. All right, so white plays knight f3. Quick quiz for those of you who've followed my opening videos. What key square are the players fighting over in this variation? And it really... Yeah, I mean, from a tactical point of view, it's these two squares, right? And there's like this violent tactics going on. If we back away from those tactics for a moment and ask ourselves strategically, what square are the two players fighting for in the center in terms of our normal, like, you know, normally it's either these two squares or these two squares, and sometimes it's one of them more than the other. In this case, what they're really fighting over is not e4 actually, but it's e5, which is unusual because black played the opening as if they were fighting for the e4 square with b5, right? They're trying to undermine this d5 pawn and keep control of e4. By rushing this pawn to b4. What we see here is a typical fight over the e4 square, and that seems to be what the opening is about. So I'm not surprised that several of you guessed e4. This definitely has all the trappings of a fight over e4 kind of opening, right? Like a knight or Sicilian with a quick b5, b4, right? But interestingly, because white is going for this crazy knight c7, knight d6 kind of tactics, he actually creates a situation where he's not even going to fight for e4 with black. He's like, you can take the e-pawn whenever you want, okay? Because that's going to open up the e-file for me, which I'm going to combine with my tactics. So white is completely not fighting over the e4 square. In some ways, it could be reminiscent of the following situation. Imagine a Ruy Lopez for a second. You know how in the Ruy Lopez, the e4 pawn is hanging, but white just leaves it hanging for several moves, or actually not that long, right? But like, there's a whole way of playing the double king pawn openings where you leave this pawn hanging saying, if black ever takes it, great, I'll use the e-file. Meanwhile, I'm going to try and like keep playing as if the fight is all about the d4 and e5 pair of squares that I'm trying to fight for with these pieces, right? So there's that whole kind of like take on the e4 pawn. It's a little bit rare, and usually it only occurs for about one move in the Ruy Lopez's because then they play rook to e1 here. It's usually only like one moment of time. But that's the first comparison that pops into my mind. So what we have here is white saying, I don't even need this e4 pawn. I'm actually fighting you over the e5 square because I want to get rid of this pawn and open the e-file. So when you see black play d6 here, it's to fight for control over e5. And when white then plays knight f3, they're again trying to threaten e5 themselves. Okay, and the idea is if black plays a move like g6, white will just play e5, takes and takes. Now, what this has done is it's opened up the possibility for his bishop f4 to come into contact with these squares with the knight and create tactical possibilities for that knight. Okay? It's also opening up the possibility for maybe d6 to also come into contact with these key squares for the knight and open up the queen's control over d6. So white is trying to open the position. He has this, white has this knight on b5 that's super committed, and if white sits around, black can eventually play like, rook a5, bishop a6, queen b6, something like that, right? And like win the game without even doing anything. So white is actually kind of desperate to open up the game, and he's willing to lose the e-pawn in any way, whether through knight takes e4 or through e5, in order to try and create some justification for the position of his knight, which is, his knight is a very important kind of square. It's a square that's very useful but very vulnerable. And when we talk about how well a piece is placed, there's 3 principles. I'm not going to go over it in detail right now because it's a separate lesson, but there's how useful it is there, how safe it is there or secure, and how much flexibility it has from there, whether it can switch to other roles. The knight on b5 has very strong usefulness because it's attacking some key squares and making some big threats. But it's also extremely vulnerable, not secure, right? Not well defended, and not flexible. It can't move around at all. So it's a very risky piece, and white's trying to make use of its strengths before suffering from its weaknesses. So after knight f3, black does not take on e4, which they can. This is a playable move. It doesn't lose instantly here. How good or bad it is a subject of deeper analysis than we can do today. I'll just say that at the surface level, knight e4 should be playable for white and for black. It should neither lose on the spot nor win on the spot. Like, it's okay for white to sack this pawn, and it's okay for black to take it. But in this game, black plays knight bd7, covering the e5 square for the moment, okay? Now, white plays bishop f4. Again, what square is white fighting for? In terms of a strategic, if we again ignore the crazy knight, strategically, white's clearly fighting black for this e5 square. And more generally in the shape of this game, white is trying to, now trade these 2 pawns so his bishop can come in contact with some of these tactics for the knight, because white's desperate to make use of that knight before it dies. So bishop f4 is played. And here, black tries to deal with the fact that white seems to be winning control over e5 by playing the move knight h5. Now, this well-intentioned move is the major mistake of this game, okay? It ends up being a move which loses time, which you can see that it does, and therefore it's not really an acceptable move. So even if you feel like you need to stop e5 here, it turns out you can't do it with time-losing moves like this. So white saves the bishop and plays bishop g5. Now the bishop has moved twice and the knight has moved twice. So each player has only lost 1 tempo, which means nobody's lost a tempo yet. However, the knight is now on a terrible square and is going to have to move again at some point, and the bishop is on a perfectly good square and does not need to move again, right? Let's count the tactical elements again here, okay? This piece is now undefended. This piece still can't move. The knight is still in contact with these things. There's now a hidden attack between the bishop and queen. Hey, Siddhartha, welcome. And we now have an overworked piece, right? We've got a pawn with what I call multiple responsibilities. It's responsible for preventing bishop takes queen, and it's responsible for preventing knight takes d6. So suddenly there's been this acceleration of bad tactical elements for black. And the situation is already a little bit dangerous. There's not like 100 moves to defend against white's simple threats here of like knight d6, basically. And white sort of has a secondary threat of e5 if they needed it, depending on what black does. But anyway, to avoid knight d6, One option for black would be to simply move the knight straight back to f6. And it's not super attractive, but it is probably the best thing black could do here. That said, the game pursues with queen to a5. Now, this move actually seems pretty well intentioned at first. Please excuse me for having a cold. It eliminates a couple of black's bad tactical elements. And sometimes the key thing you have to do in a position is just clean up some of your bad tactical elements. So in this case, black unburdens the pawn on e7, gets rid of the hidden attack of the bishop on his queen, and gives the king, technically, well, not technically, gives the king a flight square. So the king is no longer trapped. So black cleans up like 3 bad tactical elements in one move, which is good. I'm a fan of that. It's definitely the kind of thing you need to do. When you're getting to like 5 or 6 bad tactical elements, right, which black was at, that's when you start looking for tactics, for winning tactics for white. And that's when your strategy as black is not like, how do I give my opponent a doubled pawn, or how do I develop faster? Your strategy is, how do I avoid tactics popping up for my opponent by cleaning up my bad tactical elements? Unfortunately, white has a super, super strong move here. And it's not an obvious move to see, so I've beaten a lot of people with this move in Benoni structures, in Benoni and Benko games in my life, just because it's not an obvious move to see. But it's actually a kind of typical move that's super strong, and it is the old knight pirouette. Now, you guys may know that in the Benoni, there's a typical knight maneuver, knight f3, d2, c4. But somehow in tactical situations, people are less likely to see this coming. But this is a super good move from white. So if you look at the tactical elements here, white's king is now, there's a hidden attack on the king, undefended. This piece is now both unable to move, and since queen a5 was played, it's barely defended 1-1, right? So black's basically threatening like bishop a6, winning the game. You know, and black's not winning here, but he is threatening to win. So you got to take that seriously. Knight d2 cleans up one bad tactical element and uses this energy of the queen's attack on h5 to complete a very, very important maneuver of the knight to c4, which is going to be very strong. All right, with queen h5 threatened, black doesn't have a ton of options. They could play a move like bishop a6, sacrificing, like trying to just sacrifice one pawn. You know, with something like this in mind. You know, you could try something like this as black. It's like plausible. White can, however, still play a move like knight b3 or knight c4, which is more complicated. If queen b5, knight d6, pawn d6, bishop b5, and queen h5 is winning for white. This is kind of like the crux of why knight d2 is good here, is because you can actually still play, you can still play knight c4 even with this piece hanging over here because of the knight d6 move. So that would force the basically trapped queen back to d6. And now, instead of taking on h5, we can do better with knight d6 check. And this wins. Okay, so the plausible bishop a6 basically just loses to knight c4. And so in the game, black saves this knight to f6. Yeah, this is clearly better than g6 because you actually need to block the bishop's hidden attack on d8, because when knight c4 comes, this queen is suddenly a piece with a very, very limited mobility, right? Very, very few squares it can go to. If you look at how many squares we have covered, right? There's basically like a6, there's knight c7, queen a4, white has b3 actually, and not to mention that the queen has to stop knight c7, so to some extent, even if white didn't have b3 here, there would still be like knight c7, knight takes a8 winning for white. So the queen has to come back here, and then there's this winning tactic again, right? So the knight has to come back to f6 in order to block this diagonal, and now white plays knight c4. And the only square for the queen to retreat and not allow a winning knight c7 move is back to d8. Okay, so tactical elements now. White still has this undefended piece and this undefended piece, right? Ever since he started the maneuver, the downside of blocking the king on this diagonal was leaving this piece undefended. So white definitely has his own bad tactical elements here. Look at that. 3 completely undefended pieces and 1 piece that can't move. That is enough bad tactical elements that white needs to be on their toes at every moment this game, because they can lose like that. Just instantly can lose to a tactic. They've got enough bad tactical elements. Black has cleaned up the hanging knight on h5, but actually still finds themselves with a lot of tactical problems. This knight is in contact with the c7 thing, right? The king has no squares. It's a trap piece. There's 2 knights in contact with this knight d6 move to try and smother and mate him. There's a hidden attack of the bishop on the queen and the queen on the bishop. And there's some, like, some pieces with a couple responsibilities here in terms of blocking the attack and defending d6. There's an undefended piece on a8. Could come up in some case where white plays knight c7 or knight b6. It might matter that it's undefended now, or in some line with a4, pawn takes a3 kind of stuff. Okay, so we've got this kind of critical tactical situation. And in this position, white makes a strategic decision to basically play for tactics because black has enough bad tactical elements. Now, this is not a thing where the opponent has enough bad tactical elements that white can calculate a tactical approach and play a tactical variation that they know is forcing and good. No, it's a strategical approach because it's not forced. White is going to play a move designed to continue to give black more and more bad tactical elements, with the idea that perhaps eventually there will be a way to cash in on that tactical energy or advantage that white will have. But this is not a tactical play by white because there's no way to calculate this and it's not forced. Okay, it's a strategical play for tactics. And I hope you understand that. If you've got questions about it, please ask, because that's kind of like the crux of what makes this a very unusual game, and I'm hoping that you will get it. So here white plays the pawn sacrifice e5. And the point of this pawn sacrifice is shown when we show the resulting position. Trades, 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 and developing the bishop here. What has white achieved by sacrificing the pawn? Well, they've basically achieved some new bad tactical elements for black, or new tactical possibilities for white. Now the move d6 is in the air to try and play knight c7, and d6 may well be possible depending on how this diagonal is looking, right? If they play d6, they'll not only have knight c7 in the air, but also they'll be looking at this tactical point on f7, which is kind of barely defended. And also we talked about this undefended rook. White might be preparing a move such as like queen f3 or queen d5. Depending on whether we play d6 or whether we trade this piece, right? So we could get access to an undefended piece on an open diagonal, possibly on an open line, if we can play d6. However, white himself remains with some bad tactical elements, right? 2 undefended pieces, no longer an undefended pawn because he just sacrificed it. So white's definitely playing a risky approach here. But the plan is just to keep increasing the number of bad tactical elements for black. One demonstration of how this kind of thing could happen is after a move like h6, white might play bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, and in this position, a very interesting move, queen to h5. This is a move which basically is continuing to increase white's tactical potential, right? The bad tactical elements for black, the points that need to be defended against, right? And it also has the idea that, with the queen off, now we could play a move like rook d1 and introduce another troublesome tactical element for black, right? Is white winning by force? Is this like a tactical line? Not exactly. There may be a defense for black. The defense for black might lose back a pawn or two, or it might sacrifice an exchange, or who knows what, right? But what white is playing for is they're just continuing to give black bad tactical elements and developing and strengthening their position overall, right? The activity of the white pieces. Every time we're trading off white pieces, we're bringing in new ones to take their place, right? When we traded the knight on c4, we brought in the bishop to c4. When we traded the bishop on f6, we brought the queen to h5, and that allowed us to also bring out the rook. So white is developing their strength and specifically also trying to give black bad tactical elements, looking to at some point maybe capitalize on that in some way. Okay? So that is kind of like hopefully like the feeling of what white is going for here and what they're playing for. And it's actually hard to come up with a good move for black to come up with like all the good moves for black to continue developing their pieces while monitoring their bad tactical elements, because black needs to deal with their bad tactical elements. They also at some point will need to develop their pieces, right? Because if white were able to just castle here and put rooks on d1 and e1, black's situation would be like a lot worse. So they do have to try to also keep up with development if possible. I mean, the number one priority is not to allow white like a winning tactic. That's true. That's number one. And number two is to also try and find ways to develop the pieces while not allowing those winning tactics. So black tries to solve their problems with tactics, noticing the bad tactical elements of white, two undefended pieces, and a trap piece. Black goes for a winning maneuver, knight to e4. So knight to e4 takes advantage of one undefended piece, and the goal is pretty simple. After bishop h4, black wants to play knight d6. Once they play knight d6, they're attacking. Again, they're gaining time off of attacking this undefended piece. They're starting to go after the piece that can't move, so it's kind of critical for it. And by blocking this d pawn, they're basically eliminating the bad tactical element of bishop f7. They're eliminating any queen f3 or queen d5 kind of moves. And they're stopping d6 with the idea of knight c7. So actually, if you look at this position here, white has a lot more good tactical elements and black has a lot more bad tactical elements if white plays d6. It opens up a whole bunch of tactical advantage for white. So if black can actually blockade on d6, the number of bad tactical elements black needs to watch suddenly drops dramatically. Trading this knight would mean he doesn't have to worry about c7. Keeping this pawn closed means he doesn't have to worry about the open piece on the diagonal, the undefended rook. Doesn't have to worry about f7. So this would be like a beautiful, beautiful cleanup for black. And then from here, he could proceed to, play moves like g6, bishop g7, castles, bishop d7, etc. Depending how white handles this. Okay. Unfortunately for black, knight e4 is also a move that temporarily exposes him even further as he's trying to take advantage of white's weakness to finish white off with knight d6. He's actually exposing himself further because temporarily he gets rid of one of the pieces that was blocking this hidden attack, meaning this pawn's multiple roles become even more important. You're welcome, Hairphones. Thank you. And also, he leaves this knight undefended for a move. Right? So now, which also leaves the d5 square undefended. So it turns out, and you guys can practice trying to calculate this for yourselves. Based on what I've said so far, you guys all know that d6 is possible here. You all know that's the key move to calculate. I can tell you that it is the move that I played, and it is the winning move. You could practice trying to calculate this before I show all the variations if you want. That's a good way to stay active and learn more here. This is going to be the winning move. And if you look at the position after d6 and count black's bad tactical elements, there's knight c7, there's the king that can barely move, there's the pawn with two responsibilities, there's the undefended rook, undefended knight, barely defended f7, knight in contact with c7, bishop in contact with f7, queen in contact with both d5 and f3, which both bring it in contact with 3 of those hanging pieces of black's, right? And the hidden attack of the bishop on the queen, and the king that can barely move, and also the queen like doesn't have that many moves. That's like 10 good tactical elements for white. So black, you know, when black plays knight e4, they increase their bad tactical elements from like 4 to 6 or 5 to 7. And then when white plays d6 himself, he adds like 3 or 4 more in one go, at least 4 more. So it goes up to like 10 or 11 in like one move. So this whole time white's been playing to give black bad tactical elements, black exposed himself a little bit more for one turn, trying to find a tactical solution to his problems. And white just like strikes. He just d6, and everything you have is like a tactical problem. And there's not going to be any defense to this. So well, threat number 1 is just knight c7. So like knight g5 loses to knight c7, not just because of the rook, but because of the king that can barely move. This is actually checkmate. So, you know, alternatively, you could sack the queen, but now you're down a queen and white's threatening this and maybe this. So should still be winning for white. I mean, it's definitely winning for white. Other candidate move for black would be to like take this pawn, right? Because you pretty much can't allow knight c7. So its variations aren't actually all that complicated. Black plays knight d6, and now white just trades it off. Losing the knight, they can come to c7. Now the pawn can't take because of bishop takes queen. The king can't come up because of knight f7. So queen d6. And now queen f3, hitting this and this. And also making way for rook to d1. And here there's not really any good move for black, shall we say. Like if you save the rook from queen a8 by moving the rook somewhere, then white can check and here and win the queen. And notice that up to this point, white has only sacked pawns. So when we win the queen, white is up like plenty to win the game here. If you try and save the queen while defending this, right, you could play something like here. Let's see, 1 second here. See, rook d1 maybe? I'm feeling rook d1, actually cutting off the king before taking on f7. And secondary threat, queen c6, right? So like on e6, there's rook d8. On f6, there's queen c6 mating. So maybe this kind of a move. I kind of want to do this. If king to c8, queen c6. And if queen c7, queen a8. And if king back here, then just here and checkmate. So king c5, queen check. There's no good moves for black from here, right? We can see that black is busted. White's not even down anything. If queen b6, queen a8. If king a7, bishop e3. So after queen f3, black simply resigns, gives up. I don't think there's any move for black that I haven't really analyzed, but yeah. So it's suddenly a winning tactic for white. That's actually pretty simple and direct when we play this d6. But there it is, a game where white simply gives black bad tactical elements again and again as a strategy, and then eventually cashes in on a tactic. And that is not a cheapo. This game is not a cheapo. It's actually a strategic game. It's just a strategic game where the tactics are in charge instead of the strategy. Okay? So this is not a cheapo. It's not like we're just hoping that eventually black would blunder into something. Like the whole game, white's actually playing good moves and black's actually under pressure. Okay? Anyone have any questions about this game before we move on to the next segment of our broadcast today? In some sense, a very, very simple game, but a little bit of an unusual game. So I imagine that these big questions of, is this strategy, is this tactics, how does strategy serve tactics or tactics serve strategy? I think this stuff is super important. It might sound like mumbo jumbo, or it might seem like, why are we even talking about it? But I think that this is important stuff to have an idea about. It's a game I played in a junior tournament in France back in like 2001 or something like that.